Do you know one of history's most controversial rebels? A man who believed he received orders from God to end slavery. A radical who massacred 5 men in Kansas, then seized a federal armory and was executed. A hero proclaimed a martyr in the North, a terrorist in the South. You've never heard his name, have you? Come on, let's discover together the bloody story of John Brown, the man who triggered the American Civil War. He was born on May 9, 1800 in Connecticut. His father was a tanner and a fervent abolitionist. Little John learned from his father not only tanning, but also a deep belief that slavery was a sin. Growing up in a Puritan family, Brown memorized the Bible from childhood and began to see himself as an instrument of God. An event he witnessed at age 12 changed his life forever. He saw a slave child being savagely beaten with an iron shovel by his owner. From that moment on, he became a relentless enemy of slavery. Throughout his life, John Brown had 2 marriages and was the father of 20 children. He worked in tanning, sheep farming, wool trading, and farming, but none of his businesses were truly successful. He always went bankrupt, was always in debt, but never gave up his abolitionist beliefs. In 1849, he moved his family to North Elba, New York. Here, he began living on land donated to the black community by Gerrit Smith, a wealthy abolitionist. Brown was one of the rare white men who lived among free blacks and saw them as equals. 1854 became the year that changed John Brown's fate. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act that year. This law stipulated that settlers themselves would decide whether there would be slavery in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. Soon both pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups began flooding into Kansas. Especially the pro-slavery armed groups called Border Ruffians, coming from neighboring Missouri, used fraudulent votes in Kansas elections and established a pro-slavery government. Brown's 5 sons had gone to Kansas and were asking their father for weapons. The 55-year-old John Brown went to Kansas in September 1855 with a wagon full of swords, guns, and gunpowder. The time for just talking had passed. Brown said, "These men are all talk. What we need is action, action." Kansas quickly turned into a bloodbath. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces were attacking each other. On March 30th, 1855, hundreds of heavily armed Missouri residents crossed the Kansas border and used fraudulent votes in the elections by exploiting legal loopholes. The pro-slavery legislature established through these fraudulent elections passed laws that made even anti-slavery publications a crime. On May 21st, 1856, the event known in history as the sacking of Lawrence occurred. Approximately 800 Southerners attacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, set buildings on fire, and destroyed an anti-slavery newspaper. Around the same time, another scandal occurred in the Senate. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner gave a speech criticizing the violence in Kansas, and 2 days later, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks brutally attacked Sumner with his cane, leaving him bloody and unconscious. When news of the Lawrence attack and Sumner's beating reached Kansas, according to witnesses, Brown went mad. He set out on a secret mission at midnight. On the night of May 24, 1856, with his 4 sons and 2 to 3 friends, he went to a pro-slavery settlement at Pottawatomie Creek. In Franklin County, just north of Pottawatomie Creek, they kidnapped and killed 5 pro-slavery settlers. Among the murdered men were James P. Doyle and his 2 sons, William Sherman and Allen Wilkinson. Brown and 6 followers killed 5 men, attacking them with broadswords, slitting their throats, and then shooting them. Brown and his men washed the blood from their swords in the creek water and left. They were never tried. The Pottawatomie Massacre launched the bloodiest 3 months of the Bleeding Kansas period. 29 people died during this 3-month period. Both sides were seeking revenge. Brown's son Frederick was shot and killed by a pro-slavery man a few months later. But Brown didn't stop. He participated in the Battle of Black Jack in June 1856 and the Battle of Pottawatomie in August. Each time he saw himself and his men as leaders of the anti-slavery struggle. But his real plan was much bigger. Brown had been preparing for a more comprehensive attack for years. He would seize the Harpers Ferry federal armory in Virginia, arm the slaves, and establish a freedom republic in the Appalachian Mountains. He needed money to carry out his plan. In 1857 to 1858, Brown met with wealthy abolitionists in Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut. William Lloyd Garrison, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Theodore Parker, George Luther Stearns, and Samuel Gridley Howe supported Brown. This group, called the Secret Six, donated thousands of dollars to Brown. With this money, Brown ordered 200 Sharps rifles and 950 pikes. In December 1858, Brown made headlines once again. He raided Missouri, killed a slave owner, and freed 11 slaves. Together with these slaves, he traveled 1,500 miles and in 82 days took them all the way to Canada to their freedom. He was ready now. In his own words, it was time to carry the war into Africa, that is, the South. On July 3, 1859, Brown arrived in Harpers Ferry with his two sons, Oliver and Owen. Using the alias Isaac Smith, he rented the Kennedy farm on the Potomac River on the Maryland side, about 5 miles from Harpers Ferry. Throughout the summer, his men gathered at this farm. During the raid, there were 21 people in total, 16 white, 5 black. During the day, they hid in the attic. At night, they could go outside. To avoid suspicion, Brown called his 15-year-old daughter Annie and his 17-year-old daughter-in-law Martha. They cooked meals and kept curious neighbors away. On Sunday evening, October 16, 1859, Brown gathered his men. After a prayer, he revealed his plan and said, "Men, get your arms. We will proceed to the ferry." At 10 p.m., they seized the bridges, took control of the U.S. Armory and the arsenal. At midnight, they took slave owners hostage and declared they were freeing the slaves. Brown told a slave owner, "I came from Kansas, and this is a slave state. I want to free all the Negroes in this state. I have possession now of the United States Armory, and if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood." But the plan didn't go at all as expected. The expectation that slaves would come to Brown in masses didn't materialize. Only a few slaves joined them. The next day, townspeople and local militia attacked. Fighting began. At 2 p.m. in the afternoon, Harpers Ferry Mayor Fontaine Beckham was shot and killed when he approached the fighting unarmed. An angry mob killed one of Brown's men, William Thompson, and threw his body into the Potomac River. On the morning of October 18th, U.S. Marine units sent by President James Buchanan arrived at Harpers Ferry under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Lee demanded they surrender, but Brown refused. At dawn, the Marines raided the engine house. After a brief and violent clash, Brown was wounded and captured. A total of 16 people died in the raid, including 10 of Brown's men. Brown and 4 of his men were captured alive, 5 escaped, and 2 were later captured. Brown's trial began on October 27, 1859. The charges were serious: treason against the state of Virginia, murder, and inciting slaves to insurrection. The trial lasted only 5 days. The jury took only 45 minutes to reach a verdict. Guilty on all charges. On November 2nd, Brown was sentenced to death. During the trial, Brown defended that his actions were in accordance with God's commands. He told the court, "I believe that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his despised poor was not wrong, but right." On the morning of December 2nd, 1859, John Brown was taken to his execution. He went there on a wagon, with his arms tied, sitting on his coffin. Before the execution, he gave his final message to the prison guard. "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." Around 11:15, 800 militiamen under the command of Colonel John T. Gibson stood guard to prevent any attempt to rescue Brown. Thousands of soldiers surrounded the gallows. The execution scene was a historic moment. Among the crowd, John Wilkes Booth, who would become Abraham Lincoln's assassin in the future, was present as a militiaman. Also present were Thomas Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart, who would become famous generals in the Civil War. Brown's body was given to his wife Mary. After a 5-day journey, the body reached the family farm in North Elba, New York on December 8th and was buried there. John Brown's execution divided America in two. In the North, church bells rang, churches prayed. Brown was seen as a martyr. Led by the Black community, Martyrs' Day ceremonies were held in 12 cities and in Canada. Businesses closed and black armbands were worn. In Albany, New York, thousands of people gathered, and when it was said that the governor of Virginia should be hanged in a just society, for minutes of applause erupted. In Detroit, church bells rang all day. In the South, however, the reaction was completely different. Brown was seen as a terrorist, a murderer, a traitor. For Southerners, Brown was the embodiment of the fear of their slaves rebelling. A white man willing to die to end slavery. Frederick Douglass, years later, said this about Brown: John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, but he began the war that ended slavery. Until he struck his blow, hope for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. When John Brown stretched forth his arm, the sky was cleared. The time for compromise had passed. Brown's Harpers Ferry raid became one of the most important triggers of the American Civil War. A contemporary newspaper said, "The Harpers Ferry invasion has advanced the cause of disunion more than all the other events since the formation of the government." Hope for compromise between North and South was lost. 16 months later, in April 1861, the Civil War began. John Brown was a controversial figure and still is today. Terrorist or freedom fighter, madman or hero, he brutally killed 5 men in Kansas, caused the deaths of 16 people at Harpers Ferry. But at the same time, as a white man, he put his life on the line to end slavery. The violence of Brown's actions disturbed even many abolitionists. But it also showed this: slavery was such a great sin that for some, it justified violence. Brown saw himself as a warrior of God and died for a holy mission. Victor Hugo wrote about Brown from France: "The death penalty for a man's life is barbarous, but the death penalty for an idea is even more barbarous." Brown's execution was not just the death of a man, it was the birth of an idea. During the Civil War, Union soldiers sang this song as they went into battle. John Brown's body lies a-moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Brown died, but his cause lived. For years later, slavery ended. Brown's prediction came true. The crimes of this guilty land were purged only with blood. So, did you know John Brown's story? Is he a freedom fighter or a terrorist? Can violence ever be justified, even for a holy purpose? You can share in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. In the next video, we'll discover another forgotten hero of history. See you soon.